Every war begins with confidence. Almost every defeat begins the same way. History often remembers wars by their endings, but defeat rarely begins at the moment of collapse. It begins at the moment of arrival. In 1965, the United States entered Vietnam with overwhelming confidence. The most powerful military on Earth stepped into a conflict thousands of miles from home, convinced that strength alone would decide the outcome. American aircraft dominated the skies. Advanced weapons, helicopters, and modern logistics created an image of unstoppable force. Washington believed technology and firepower would quickly stabilize South Vietnam. The strategy seemed logical. Contain communism, demonstrate strength, prevent another domino from falling in Southeast Asia. But Vietnam was not a conventional battlefield. There were no clear fronts, no decisive cities whose capture would end the war. The enemy avoided large confrontations, choosing patience over confrontation. American forces arrived prepared to fight a modern war. Instead, they entered a conflict shaped by history, geography, and ideology. Jungle terrain erased visibility. Villages became battlegrounds. Allies and enemies often looked identical. Every patrol carried uncertainty. Victory became difficult to measure. Commanders relied on statistics, body counts, missions flown, territory secured. Numbers suggested progress. Reality suggested something else. The war was expanding. More troops arrived. More resources were committed. Each escalation promised to bring the conflict closer to victory. But escalation created its own momentum. Because once a superpower commits its prestige, withdrawal becomes harder than continuation. The United States had not yet lost the war. But by arriving under the wrong assumptions, it had already entered a conflict that would redefine modern warfare. And the question was no longer how to win, but whether victory was ever possible at all. America entered Vietnam expecting to fight an army. Instead, it faced an idea. The enemy rarely appeared in open battle. Viet Cong fighters avoided direct confrontation, disappearing into jungles, villages, and underground tunnel networks that stretched for miles beneath the earth. There were no clear front lines. A peaceful village by day could become a battlefield by night. Farmers, civilians, and fighters often looked indistinguishable. Every interaction carried uncertainty. Every decision carried risk. For American soldiers, the battlefield became psychological. Technology offered little advantage against an enemy that refused to stand still. Helicopters could deploy troops anywhere, but the enemy simply vanished before contact. Massive firepower captured territory, yet control disappeared the moment troops moved on. Victory became temporary. Patrol after patrol searched for an opponent that chose when and if to fight. This created a dangerous imbalance. The United States needed visible success. The enemy needed only survival. Each day without defeat strengthened North Vietnamese strategy. Time itself became a weapon. Commanders turned to measurable statistics: enemy casualties, missions completed, areas cleared. Reports suggested progress. But statistics could not measure loyalty, fear, or political will. The war was no longer purely military. It was a struggle for perception inside Vietnam and back home in America. Because when an enemy becomes invisible, certainty disappears. And without certainty, even the strongest army begins to fight defensively not against defeat, but against doubt itself. The United States still possessed overwhelming power. But power meant little against an opponent that refused to fight on predictable terms. The battlefield had changed, and America had not yet realized it was fighting the wrong kind of war. By the late 1960s, the United States possessed overwhelming military power in Vietnam. Bombers dominated the skies. Helicopters controlled mobility. Advanced technology tracked enemy movement across jungles and mountains. Yet the war refused to end. American commanders searched for battlefields where victory could be measured. They wanted decisive engagements, large battles that could destroy enemy forces once and for all. But the enemy refused to fight that kind of war. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army avoided permanent front lines. They appeared suddenly, attacked quickly, and disappeared into villages, tunnels, forests, and civilian populations. There was no clear territory to capture, no capital whose fall would end the conflict. Every village secured during the day could fall back under enemy influence at night. The battlefield was everywhere and nowhere. American strategy became a war of numbers. Body counts replaced territory as the measure of success. Commanders reported enemy casualties as proof that victory was approaching. But numbers created an illusion. For every loss, new fighters replaced the fallen. The enemy's strategy was not to win battles, but to survive them. The United States fought to end the war quickly. North Vietnam fought simply not to lose. Massive search and destroy operations swept through jungles. Helicopters inserted troops into hostile zones, only for the enemy to vanish before decisive contact. Soldiers began to feel they were fighting shadows. Ambushes came without warning. Mines and booby traps caused constant fear. The enemy controlled when and where combat happened. Technology struggled against patience. Power struggled against persistence. Meanwhile, the war expanded beyond the battlefield. Television brought images of combat directly into American homes for the first time in history. Public confidence began to fracture. The war had no visible progress, no clear victories, and no end in sight. America had entered Vietnam expecting a conventional war. Instead, it faced a conflict without front lines, without clear rules, and without a decisive victory to achieve. The question was no longer how to win. It was whether victory was even possible. By the late 1960s, American forces were winning almost every major battle in Vietnam. Superior firepower allowed the United States to dominate direct combat. Artillery strikes shattered enemy positions. Helicopter mobility placed American troops anywhere within minutes. Massive bombing campaigns targeted supply routes deep inside enemy territory. On paper, victory seemed inevitable. Military reports measured success through numbers. Enemy casualties increased month after month. Commanders presented statistics proving that communist forces were suffering devastating losses. But the numbers hid a dangerous reality. The enemy was not trying to win battles. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong understood that defeating the United States militarily was nearly impossible. Instead, their strategy focused on endurance. They accepted heavy losses as the cost of a longer war. American strategy depended on measurable progress. The Vietnamese strategy depended on patience. Search and destroy missions became routine. American troops would enter hostile regions, engage enemy fighters, and then withdraw once the operation ended. Territory changed hands repeatedly without producing lasting control. A village declared secure one week could become hostile again the next. Victory existed only temporarily. The United States was fighting a war designed for decisive outcomes. Vietnam had become a war without decisive moments. Meanwhile, massive bombing campaigns, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, attempted to break enemy morale. Thousands of tons of explosives fell across North Vietnam, yet the political leadership and military resistance remained intact. Technology delivered tactical superiority, but failed to achieve strategic results. The battlefield increasingly favored the side willing to absorb punishment longer. American soldiers began to realize that success in combat did not bring the war closer to ending. Each operation looked similar to the last. Progress felt invisible. The war was no longer about defeating an enemy army. It had become a contest of endurance, political will, and perception. And slowly, the United States faced a disturbing truth. It was winning battles while losing the war. By early 1968, American commanders believed the war in Vietnam was finally under control. Reports showed progress. Enemy casualties were rising. Military pressure was increasing. Officials spoke about light at the end of the tunnel. On the surface, it looked like the strategy was working. But the enemy was preparing something completely different. On the night of the Lunar New Year, Tet North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive coordinated offensive across South Vietnam. It was not a single battle. It was a nationwide shock. Cities, military bases, government buildings, and American positions were attacked simultaneously. The scale of coordination surprised even intelligence agencies. For a moment, the illusion of control collapsed. Fighting erupted in places that were previously considered secure. Even the American embassy in Saigon came under direct attack. Militarily, the United States and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled most of the assaults. The attackers suffered enormous losses. In pure battlefield terms, the offensive failed. But the real outcome of Tet was not measured in territory or casualties. It was measured in perception. For the first time, the American public saw the war not as a controlled effort, but as a conflict without a clear end. Television broadcasts showed intense urban combat, destroyed streets, and chaotic fighting across the country they were told was nearly stabilized. Confidence in official reports began to collapse. If this was progress, what did failure look like? The Tet Offensive did not destroy American forces in Vietnam. It destroyed the belief that victory was near. And in modern war, perception can be more decisive than territory. After Tet, the political and psychological foundation of the war began to shift. Support weakened. Doubt increased. The idea of an achievable victory slowly disappeared from public conversation. From this moment forward, the question was no longer whether the United States could win the war. It was whether winning meant anything at all. After the Tet Offensive, the war in Vietnam changed in a way that had nothing to do with the battlefield. On the ground, American and South Vietnamese forces continued to win most engagements. Militarily, the United States remained dominant. But something far more important began to break: confidence. For the first time, large parts of American society started to question the war itself. The images coming from Vietnam no longer matched official statements. Television broadcasts showed destruction, chaos, and casualties, while government reports still spoke about progress. This gap created doubt, and doubt spread faster than any military operation. Anti-war protests grew across the United States. Students filled streets in major cities. Public debates became more intense, more emotional, and more divided. The war was no longer something happening far away. It had entered everyday American life. Soldiers returning from Vietnam faced a different reality at home. Instead of celebration, many encountered uncertainty or opposition. The connection between the battlefield and public support began to weaken. Inside Vietnam, the situation also changed. Even successful operations no longer felt meaningful. Territory gained during military campaigns could not guarantee long-term control. The enemy continued to fight, regardless of losses or setbacks. This created a slow realization within military leadership: winning battles was no longer enough. The political cost of the war was rising faster than any military success could justify. As the conflict continued, the United States faced a new kind of pressure, not from the enemy in Vietnam, but from its own internal divisions. The war was no longer defined by advances or retreats on a map. It was defined by patience, and patience was running out. The strongest military in the world was still fighting, but the belief that victory was possible was beginning to disappear. And when belief collapses, wars end long before the last shot is fired. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had reached a stage where victory could no longer be clearly defined. On the battlefield, American forces were still capable of winning engagements. Superior firepower, air mobility, and logistics allowed them to dominate most direct confrontations. But war is not decided by battlefield performance alone. It is decided by whether that performance leads to a political outcome. And in Vietnam, that link had broken. The United States was fighting a war designed for decisive military victory, but the enemy was not trying to achieve military victory at all. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong were fighting a war of endurance. They did not need to defeat the United States in battle. They only needed to continue fighting long enough for political pressure to change the outcome. Every year that passed made the war more difficult to sustain domestically in the United States. Public support declined, political divisions deepened. The idea of a clear victory slowly disappeared from national discourse. This created a strategic imbalance. One side needed to win quickly. The other only needed to not lose. And in conflicts like this, time becomes the deciding force. Even major military operations could not change this equation. Territory gained during campaigns did not translate into lasting control. Enemy forces reappeared after setbacks. The battlefield reset itself again and again. There was no final position to capture, no decisive collapse that would end resistance. The war had become continuous. Inside the United States, the cost of the conflict increasingly outweighed any visible progress. Leaders faced growing pressure to reduce involvement. The original objective, a stable pro-Western South Vietnam, became harder to define and even harder to achieve. By the time withdrawal began, the outcome had already been shaped, not by a single battle, but by the nature of the war itself. Vietnam demonstrated a harsh truth about modern conflict. Military superiority does not guarantee victory, especially when the opponent is willing to endure longer than you are willing to fight. The United States did not lose Vietnam in one moment of failure. It lost it in a long process where each side played a different game. One side fought to win, the other fought to continue. And in the end, endurance proved stronger than power. The war could not be won because it was never a conventional war in the first place. It was a test of will, time, and political endurance. And in that kind of war, there is no final battlefield victory. Only the point where one side decides it can no longer continue. History teaches the same lesson again and again. Even the greatest powers fall.